Hello and welcome to this e-module on hazard identification and risk assessment. Let's take a look at the learning objectives of this module. By the end of this module, you will be able to explain hazard identification and risk assessment, list the factors creating or increasing hazards, explain the planning and conducting of HIRA, describe the process of HIRA, identify hazards, explain the hazard identification technique. Describe the hazard identification and assessment methodology. Analyze risks. Perform risk assessment. Explain risk control. Identify the risk assessment procedure. Monitor controls. Understand safe work procedures. Perform job hazard analysis, that is JHA. Document HIRA. Identify statutory regulations and compliances. Understand vulnerable groups and mitigation actions. Explain the impact on business. What is HIRA and why is it required at any workplace? Let us try to understand. Hazard identification and risk analysis, that is HIRA, is a collective term that encompasses all activities involved in identifying hazards and evaluating risk at facilities throughout their life cycle to ensure that risks to employees, the public, or the environment are consistently controlled within the organization's risk tolerance. These studies typically address three main risk questions to a level of detail commensurate with analysis objectives: life cycle stage, available information, and resources. Safety in any operation works best if the person or people in charge take a leading role in managing safety and health. Many business enterprises have proven that good safety management leads to increased productivity. By having a good safety management program, one can avoid not only injuries but also other incidents that are costly, time-consuming, stressful, and inconvenient, which makes good economic sense. How can this be accomplished? Let us take a look at the steps that need to be taken by an employer at the workplace in the next screen. In order to manage the risk at any workplace, every employer is required to carry out a risk assessment, that is RA, for the workplace, which should identify any hazards present, assess the risks arising from such hazards, and identify the steps to be taken to deal with any risks. The employer must also prepare a safety statement which is based on the risk assessment. The statement should also contain the details of people in the workforce who are responsible for safety issues. Employees should be given access to this statement and employers should review it on a regular basis. This is called the Safe Work Method Statement, or SWMS, covered in detail in module on change requests. Risk assessment training is an important step in protecting workers and the business, as well as complying with the law. It helps to focus on the risks that really matter in the workplace, the ones with the potential to cause harm. Risk assessment training is simply a careful examination of what in the work could cause harm to people, so that we can weigh up whether we have taken enough precautions or should do more to prevent harm. Workers and others have a right to be protected from harm caused by a failure to take reasonable control measures. The three main risk questions to ask are: hazard, what can go wrong? Consequences, how bad could it be? Likelihood, how often might it happen? Let's now look at some of the important terms and their definitions. Hazard means a source or a situation with a potential for harm in terms of human injury or ill health, damage to property, damage to the environment, or a combination of these. Hazard control means the process of implementing measures to reduce the risk associated with a hazard. Hierarchy of control means the established priority order for the types of measures to be used to control risks. Hazard identification means the identification of undesired events that lead to the materialization of the hazard, and the mechanism by which those undesired events could occur. Risk means a combination of the likelihood of an occurrence of a hazardous event with specified period or in specified circumstances and the severity of injury or damage to the health of people, property, environment, or any combination of these caused by the event. Risk assessment means the process of evaluating the risks to safety and health arising from hazards at work. Risk management means the total procedure associated with identifying a hazard, assessing the risk, putting in place control measures, and reviewing the outcomes. Next, let's understand what risk is. Risk is something that we as individuals live with on a day-to-day basis. People are constantly making decisions based on risk. Simple decisions in daily life such as driving, crossing the road, and money investment all imply an acceptance risk. Risk is the combination of the likelihood and severity of a specified hazardous event occurring. In mathematical terms, risk can be calculated by the question: risk is equal to likelihood multiplied by severity, where likelihood is an event likely to occur within the specific period or in specified circumstances, and severity is outcome from an event such as severity of injury or health of people, or damage to property, or insult to environment, or any combination of those caused by the event. Next, let's understand hazard identification and risk assessment in detail. Hazard identification and risk assessment, that is HIRA, is a process that consists of a number of sequential steps such as hazard identification, consequences and frequency assessment, risk estimation based on the existing controls, and recommendations to reduce those risks which are not under acceptable limits. A core challenge faced by facility managers is how to prevent, prepare, mitigate, respond, and recover from the countless hazards in a workplace. Several questions arise when faced with this challenge. What hazards exist in the area? How frequently do they occur? How severe can their impact be on the employees, infrastructure, property, and the environment? Which hazards pose the greatest threat to the employees? Thus, HIRA assists the facility managers in answering these questions. It is a systematic risk assessment tool that can be used to assess the risk of various hazards. There are basically 3 steps used to manage health and safety at work, namely, spot the hazard, that is hazard identification, assess the risk, that is risk assessment, make the changes, that is risk control. Some workplace activities may create or increase hazards if they are not properly managed. Let's look at them. Purchasing policies. For example, if the products, plant, materials and personal protective equipment that are selected are the cheapest one and are not safely designed, not suitable for the job or suited to the workers using it, or are of inadequate quality. Roles, responsibilities and accountabilities. For example, if they are not clearly defined, people will not know what they have to do, when or how to do it. It applies especially in emergency situations. Excessive physical and mental tasks and job demands which may lead to an inability to keep the worker's mind on the job. Organizational arrangements such as shift work and rosters may lead to fatigue and human error where workers are working for long hours or are working more than one job. Levels of supervision and ratio of supervisors to workers. For example, greater levels of supervision are appropriate in some areas. Key performance indicators. For example, when set too high, they create unrealistic performance targets, which can increase the worker's tendency to take shortcuts and increase risks while trying to achieve the targets. Maintenance and servicing programs for plant to cover wear and tear training programs, where risk management of property is emphasized over the risk management of people and safety. Economic drive. Let us now understand the purpose of HIRA, which is to identify all the factors that may cause harm to employees and others, that is the hazards, to consider what the chances are of that harm actually befalling anyone in the circumstances of a particular case and the possible severity that could come from it, that is the risks, and to enable employees to plan, introduce and monitor preventive measures to ensure that the risks are adequately controlled at all times. Once we have understood the purpose of HIRA, it becomes much easier to plan and conduct the activities required to control the risk elements. Let us take a look at how this is done next. HIRA activities shall be planned and conducted for situation where hazard appear to pose significant threat, uncertain whether existing controls are adequate and before implementing corrective or preventive measures. By organization intending to continuously improve OSH management system, it should be the duty of the employer to assign some trained personnel to lead a team of employees associated with one particular process or activity to conduct HIRA. Let us now delve deeper into the process of HIRA and the steps involved. Process of HIRA requires 4 simple steps. Classify work activities, identify hazard, conduct risk assessment, that is analyze and estimate risk from each hazard by calculating or estimating likelihood of occurrence, severity of hazard. Decide if risk is tolerable and apply control measures if necessary. We will now look at each one of these steps in detail in the following sections. Work activities can be classified in accordance with their similarity, such as geographical or physical areas within or outside premises, stages in production or service process. Not too big, for example, building a car. Not too small, for example, fixing a nut. Or defined task, for example, loading, packing, mixing, or fixing the door. Next, let us understand the process of identifying hazards. Hazard identification is the process of identifying all hazards in the workplace. The purpose of hazard identification is to highlight the critical operations of tasks, that is, those tasks posing significant risks to the health and safety of employees, as well as highlighting those hazards pertaining to certain equipment due to energy sources, working conditions, or activities performed. Hazards can be divided into 3 main groups: health hazards, safety hazards, and environmental hazards. Let's individually understand each one of them. Let's first look at health hazards. An occupational health hazard is any agent that can cause illness to an individual. A health hazard may produce serious and immediate, that is acute effects, or may cause long-term, that is chronic problems. All or part of the body may be affected. Someone with an occupational illness may not recognize the symptoms immediately. For example, noise-induced hearing loss is often difficult for the affected individual to detect until it is well advanced. Health hazards include chemicals such as battery acid and solvents, biological hazards such as bacteria, viruses, dusts, and molds. Physical agents, that is energy sources strong enough to harm the body, such as electric currents, heat, light, vibration, noise, and radiation. And work design, that is ergonomic hazards. Next, let us understand safety hazards. A safety hazard is any force strong enough to cause injury or damage to property. An injury caused by a safety hazard is usually obvious. For example, a worker may be badly cut. Safety hazards cause harm when workplace controls are not adequate. Some examples of safety hazards include, but are not limited to, slipping or tripping hazards, such as wires run across floors, fire hazards from flammable materials, moving parts of machinery, tools and equipment, such as pinch and nip points, work at height, such as work done on scaffolds, ejection of material, such as from molding, pressure systems, such as steam boilers and pipes, vehicles, such as forklifts and trucks, lifting and other manual handling operations, and working alone. The last type of hazard that we are going to learn about is environmental hazard. An environmental hazard is a release to the environment that may cause harm or deleterious effects. An environmental release may not be obvious. For example, a worker who drains a glycol system and releases the liquid to a storm sewer may not be aware of the effect on the environment. Environmental hazards cause harm when controls and work procedures are not followed. The employer shall develop a hazard identification and assessment methodology taking into account some documents and information. Let's look at them. Any hazardous occurrence investigation reports, first aid reports and minor injury records, workplace health protection programs, any results of workplace inspections, any employee complaints and comments, any government or employee reports, studies and tests concerning the health and safety of employees, any reports made under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, that is OSHA 1994, the record of hazardous substances, any other relevant information. Next, let us look at the hazard identification and assessment methodology, which includes the following: steps and time frame for identifying and assessing the hazards. One must define the steps for the identification of hazards and a time frame for this identification. The following information included: who will be responsible for the identification. For example, it may be the Workplace Health and Safety Committee or an individual or individuals appointed by the committee. The way in which the identification reports are processed. For example, they may be compiled and processed by the committee or by individuals appointed by the committee. The identification time frame. For example, the identification of hazards for Workshop A must be completed in December, for Workshop B in April, and for Workshop C in November. The keeping of a record of the hazards. After having identified the hazards, one must establish and maintain an identification record either in print or electronic format. A time frame for reviewing and, if necessary, revising the methodology. The date for the review of the identification. For example, the review of the identification method will be carried out every 3 years. To complete hazard identification, one can use techniques to identify hazards. Some examples of techniques include, but are not limited to, workplace inspections, task safety analysis or job hazard analysis, preliminary investigations, potential accident factors, failure analysis, accident and incident investigations. Now that we have learned and understood about hazard identification and its process, it is time to move on to the next step, which is risk analysis. Let us now delve deeper into the topic of risk analysis and how it is done. Risk is the determination of likelihood and severity of the credible accident or event sequences in order to determine magnitude and to prioritize identified hazards. It can be done by qualitative, quantitative or semi-quantitative method. Let us look at each in detail. A qualitative analysis uses words to describe the magnitude of potential severity and the likelihood that those severity will occur. These scales can be adapted or adjusted to suit the circumstances, and different descriptions may be used for different risks. This method uses expert knowledge and experience to determine likelihood and severity category. In semi-quantitative analysis, qualitative scales such as those described above are given values. The objective is to produce a more expanded ranking scale than is usually achieved in qualitative analysis, not to suggest realistic values for risk such as is attempted in quantitative analysis. Quantitative analysis uses numerical values rather than the descriptive scales used in qualitative and semi-qualitative analysis. for both severity and likelihood using data from a variety of sources such as past accident experience and from scientific research. Severity may be determined by modeling the outcomes of an event or set of events or by extrapolation from experimental studies or past data. Severity may be expressed in terms of monetary, technical, or human impact criteria, or any of the other criteria. The way in which severity and likelihood are expressed and the ways in which they are combined to provide a level of risk will vary accordingly to the type of risk and the purpose for which the risk assessment output is to be used. Now it is important to understand when an event is likely to occur. In other words, the likelihood of an occurrence which highlights its probability of occurring at a workplace. This is rated as a value and can be analyzed in the following manner. Let's understand with the help of this table. You may ask the question, how many times has this event happened in the past? Assessing likelihood is based on worker experience, analysis, or measurement. Likelihood levels range from most likely to inconceivable. For example, a small spill of bleach from a container when filling a spray bottle is most likely to occur during every shift. Alternatively, a leak of diesel fuel from a secure holding tank may be less probable. Once the likelihood of an occurrence is analyzed, the next step would be to rate its severity. Let's see how this is done with the help of this table. Severity can be divided into 5 categories. Severity are based upon an increasing level of severity to an individual's health, the environment, or to property. In the earlier section, we learned to analyze the risk elements by rating them according to their probability of occurrence and their level of severity. Next, we will understand how to assess the risk. Risk can be presented in a variety of ways to communicate the results of analysis to make decision on risk control. For risk analysis that uses likelihood and severity in qualitative method, presenting result in a risk matrix is a very effective way of communicating the distribution of the risk throughout a plant and area in a workplace. Risk can be calculated using the following formula. L into S is equal to relative risk. L is equal to likelihood. S is equal to severity. Here is an example of risk matrix. To use this matrix, first find the severity column that best describes the outcome of risk. Then follow the likelihood row to find the description that best suits the likelihood that the severity will occur. The risk level is given in the box where the row and column meet. The relative risk value can be used to prioritize necessary actions to effectively manage workplace hazards. Now, let's understand how to determine the priority based on the given ranges. Hazards assessed as high risk must have immediate actions to resolve risk to life safety and to the environment. Individuals responsible for required action, including follow-up, must be clearly identified. A further detailed risk assessment method may require such as quantitative risk assessment as means of determine suitable controls measures. Now that you have learned about risk assessment, let's understand the steps involved in controlling these risk elements or risk control in greater detail. Control is the elimination or inactivation of a hazard in a manner such that the hazard does not pose a risk to workers who have to enter into an area or work on equipment in the course of scheduled work. Hazards should be controlled at their source, where the problem is created. The closer a control to the source of the hazard is, the better. This method is often referred to as applying engineering controls. If this does not work, hazards can often be controlled along the path to the worker, between the source and the worker. This method can be referred to as applying administrative controls. If this is not possible, hazards must be controlled at the level of the worker through the use of personal protective equipment, that is PPE, although this is the least desirable control. Selecting a control often involves evaluating and selecting short and long-term controls, implementing short-term measures to protect workers until permanent controls can be put in place, implementing long-term controls when reasonably practicable. For example, suppose a noise hazard is identified. Short-term controls might require workers to use hearing protection. Long-term, permanent controls might remove or isolate the noise source. Next, let us study the hierarchy of controls, which are sequential steps essentially followed to reduce the risk at the workplace in an effective and controlled manner. The different types of controls are elimination, substitution, engineering controls, awareness means, inform and personal protective equipment or PPE. Let's understand them one by one. Let's begin with elimination and substitution. Elimination. Getting rid of a hazardous job, tool, process, machine, or substance is perhaps the best way of protecting workers. For example, a salvage firm might decide to stop buying and cutting up scraped bulk fuel tanks due to explosion hazards. Substitution. Sometimes doing the same work in a less hazardous way is possible. For example, a hazardous chemical can be replaced with a less hazardous one. Controls must protect workers from any new hazards that are created. Let's now learn about engineering controls. Redesign. Jobs and processes can be reworked to make them safer. For example, containers can be made easier to hold and lift. Isolation. If a hazard cannot be eliminated or replaced, it can sometimes be isolated, contained, or otherwise kept away from workers. For example, an insulated and air-conditioned control room can protect operators from a toxic chemical. Automation. Dangerous processes can be automated or mechanized. For example, computer-controlled robots can handle spot welding operations in car plants. Care must be taken to protect workers from robotic hazards. Barriers. A hazard can be blocked before it reaches workers. For example, special curtains can prevent eye injuries from welding arc radiation. Proper equipment guarding will protect workers from contacting moving parts. Absorption. Baffles can block or absorb noise. Lockout systems can isolate energy sources during repair and maintenance. Usually, the further a control keeps a hazard away from workers, the more effective it is. Dilution. Some hazards can be diluted or dissipated. For example, ventilation systems can dilute toxic gases before they reach operators. Let us look at the various administrative controls. Safe work procedures. Workers can be required to use standardized safety practices. The employer is expected to ensure that workers follow these practices. Work procedures must be periodically reviewed with workers and updated. Supervision and training. Initial training on safe work procedures and refresher training should be offered. Appropriate supervision to assist workers in identifying possible hazards and evaluating work procedures. Job rotations. Job rotations and other procedures can reduce the time that workers are exposed to a hazard. For example, workers can be rotated through jobs requiring repetitive tendon and muscle movements to prevent cumulative trauma injuries. Noisy processes can be scheduled when no one is in the workplace. Housekeeping, repair, and maintenance programs. Housekeeping includes cleaning, waste disposal, and spill cleanup. Tools, equipment, and machinery are less likely to cause injury if they are kept clean and well maintained. Hygiene. Hygiene practices can reduce the risk of toxic materials being absorbed by workers or carried home to their families. Street clothing should be kept in separate lockers to avoid being contaminated by work clothing. Eating areas must be segregated from toxic hazards. Eating should be forbidden in toxic work areas. Where applicable, workers should be required to shower and change clothes at the end of the shift. The flowchart on screen shows the steps of the risk controls and how they are all interlinked. The last type of control that we are going to learn about is personal protective equipment, that is PPE. Personal protective equipment means any equipment which is intended to be worn or held by a person at work and which protects him against one or more risks to his health or safety and any additional accessory designed to meet that objective. Personal protective equipment, that is PPE, and clothing is used when other controls measures are not feasible and where additional protection is needed. Workers must be trained to use and maintain equipment properly. The employer and workers must understand the limitations of the personal protective equipment. The employer is expected to require workers to use their equipment whenever it is needed. Care must be taken to ensure that equipment is working properly. Otherwise, PPE may endanger a worker's health by providing an illusion of protection. PPE is usually chosen to provide protection appropriate to each of type of hazard present. There are specifications for the types of PPE used for protecting an individual's head, eyes, footwear, limb, and body. Fire retardant clothing, respiratory, hearing, and personal flotation devices. It may also include required apparel, for example, when traffic hazards are present, high visible and distinguishable vests must be worn. Next, we will learn about the risk assessment procedure in greater detail. The account manager or facilities manager, site lead, and/or engineering manager are responsible for the risk assessment. The risk assessment shall be performed in accordance with their levels of severity and frequency of exposure and documented using the risk assessment register form. Residual risks associated with a particular hazard are qualitatively assessed using some tables and principles as follows. The three stages of risk are inherent risk, current risk, and residual risk. Let's understand them. Inherent risk is the risk that exists without any control measures in place. Current risk is the risk that exists with the current control measures in place. Residual risk is the risk that exists or is left after we have reviewed the current risk and implemented any changes. First, identify severity level of each identified hazard. Severity level is possible severity due to exposure to danger while carrying out normal working activities. Next, identify the frequency of exposure to the identified hazard. Frequency of exposure is expected frequency of occurrence due to exposure to danger during the normal execution of an activity. The effectiveness of controls must be checked regularly. Evaluate and monitor hazard controls during inspections, routine maintenance, and other activities. Ask the following questions. Have the controls solved the problem? Is any risk to workers posed by the controls contained? Are all new hazards being identified? Are significant new hazards appropriately controlled? Are accident reports being analyzed? Are any other measures required? Document control activities to track their effectiveness. If necessary, re-evaluate hazards and implement new control measures. Next, let us learn about safe work procedures. Through the completion of a job hazard analysis, that is JHA, sometimes hazards are identified and cannot be eliminated or engineered out of a particular task. Safe work procedures are step-by-step instructions that allow workers to conduct their work safely when hazards are present. A safe work procedure identifies the materials and equipment needed and how and when to use them safely. Let's learn more about these next. Safe work procedures are generally prepared for critical high-risk jobs where accidents have or could result in severe injuries. Hazardous work where accidents occur frequently. New or altered tasks have been introduced. New equipment has been added to the process. A job that requires many detailed tasks. Where two or more workers required for a job and each must perform specific tasks simultaneously. Specific tasks are done infrequently. Safe work procedures must include regulatory requirements, necessary personal protective equipment, required training, worker responsibilities, specific sequence of steps to follow to complete the work safely, required permits, and emergency procedures. An example of a task that requires the development of a safe work procedure is confined space entry. Individuals who must work within confined spaces must ensure that safe work procedures are developed and followed to maximize life safety. In the previous section, we spoke about job hazard analysis. Let us now understand more about this term and how it is done. A job hazard analysis is a technique that focuses on job tasks as a way to identify hazards before they occur. It focuses on the relationship between the worker, the task, the tools, and the work environment. Ideally, after you identify uncontrolled hazards, you will take steps to eliminate or reduce them to an acceptable risk level. A JHA can be conducted on many jobs in the workplace. Priority should go to the following types of jobs: jobs with the highest injury or illness rates, jobs with the potential to cause severe or disabling injuries or illnesses, even if there is no history of previous accidents, jobs in which one simple human error could lead to a severe accident or injury, jobs that are new to the operation or have undergone changes in processes and procedures, jobs complex enough to require written instructions. Next, let's understand how documentation of HIRA is done. Proper management of hazards sporadically identified in the workplace can be done through effective process. Ultimately, the individual or team who identified the hazard must ensure proper communication of the hazard to the appropriate workplace authority, that is, manager, department head, or designated person. Each HIRA must be fully documented. The HIRA form must be completed by the HIRA team and signed by the in-charge personnel of the area. Departments responsible for the hazards and their control are required to maintain all records of assessments for at least 3 years. In some cases, legislative requirements will determine the minimum time to retain records. The appropriate authority is responsible for ensuring that effective and timely controls are applied to the hazard and communicating the results back to the originator. Management or employer must endorse and approve the HIRA results. Employer must communicate all HIRA to employees, monitor the follow-up action, and keep the records. Now, let's look at the instructions that should be given to the team leader and other persons conducting HIRA. Complete HIRA form. It is recommended to use a single form for each work process. Record the names and designation of HIRA team members. Outline the process workflow and indicate in the form under Process or Location column. List all activities, routine and non-routine, for each work process under the Work Activity column. Identify the hazards associated with each activity and record in Hazard column. Determine the effect of each hazard identified and record in Effect column. Record any existing hazard control measures. Determine likelihood, that is L, from Table A and severity, that is S, from Table B for each hazard. By using risk matrix, Table C and D, assign one risk and record in Risk column. Based on the risk assigned, recommend appropriate risk control measures. See Table D. Assign a suitable person to implement the recommended risk control and indicate the follow-up action date and status. Repeat the HIRA for other activities and process. Conduct another round of HIRA after control measures have been implemented. Review HIRA for every 3 years or whenever there are changes in process. Major accident hazards (MAH). Industries such as oil refineries, chemical fertilizers, chemical plants, and large fuel and chemical storage facilities where large quantities of hazardous materials are stored, handled, or processed are governed by the manufacture, storage, and import of hazardous chemicals, that is MS and I8C rules 1989 and subsequent amendments. Chemical Accidents, that is Emergency Planning, Preparedness and Response Rules 1996 under the Environment Protection Act 1986 have further advocated to protect people, property and the environment from chemical accidents. This will be achieved by applying safety obligations on everyone involved with the storage, process, transport and handling of hazardous materials. Central Motor Vehicle Rules 1989 also guides to identify and control the hazards with the details about the hazards, risk and control during transportation of hazardous chemicals. The image on screen depicts the entire process or HIRA. Next, we will learn about vulnerable groups and mitigation actions. Some people may be more vulnerable to certain hazards than others due to many different reasons such as disabilities, economic status and health, and are therefore more likely to suffer from the negative impacts of a hazard. These groups may be more vulnerable to a hazard due to an inability to self-evacuate or to take the proper safety precautions, susceptible to a hazard due to their health, or a lack of access to warnings or other reasons that can increase their vulnerability to a specific hazard. Not all people who identify themselves as belong to one of these groups may be at an increased risk during the occurrence of a hazard. It will depend on the individual's specific situation. It is important to consider vulnerable groups once the hazards have been identified. Assessing vulnerability is a key consideration in planning and it can assist in mitigation action decision making. Mitigation is defined as actions taken to reduce the adverse impacts of an emergency or disaster. A HIRA is only one part of a comprehensive emergency management program. Once the risk for each of the hazards is known, it is vital that attempts be made to reduce their risks, beginning with the hazards identified as having extreme and very high levels of risk. Lastly, let's understand the impact of HIRA on business. Optimal productivity. When there is elimination of barriers that employees face when trying to complete their jobs and provide them with the proper working tools to complete tasks, productivity and the quality of work will be higher. Happier employees. Providing a safe, healthy and stress-free workplace will result in positive employee attitudes, fewer days off due to illness or stress, and a stronger commitment to the goals of the company. Better qualified employees. When people decide where to work, businesses that are known for their commitment to safety in the workplace are likely to be more attractive options. Saving money. Fewer injuries lead to fewer costs. Happy employees lead to decreased turnover and training costs. Fewer incidents lead to a lower chance of lawsuits, fines, or penalties from labor boards. Positive image. Avoiding negative publicity is good for the public image, but it also increases opportunity for the company. That brings us to the end of this module on hazard identification and risk assessment. In this module, we looked at hazard identification and risk assessment, factors creating or increasing hazards, planning and conducting of HIRA, process of HIRA, hazard identification technique, hazard identification and assessment methodology, risk analysis, risk assessment, risk control, risk assessment procedure, monitor controls, safe work procedures, job hazard analysis, that is JHA, documenting HIRA, statutory regulations and compliances, vulnerable groups and mitigation actions, impact on business.